Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Climate Leaders Live, focus on transportation electrification. I am your disembodied voice giving you the instructions that throughout the webinar, please add your questions to the Q&A option on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, not the chat option, please. We will answer questions at the end of the program. We are also recording this webinar and we'll distribute a link to the video to all attendees next week. I'll paste these instructions into the chat. And if you would like to activate closed captions below, go ahead and navigate to that toolbar at the bottom of your screen and select Show Subtitle. Thank you. We will begin in just a few moments.
Thanks, Ariana, and thanks, everyone. We're just going to give it one more minute to let a few more folks hop on and we'll get rolling.
Here we are again. Thank you, Greg. Go ahead and get started.
All right. Thanks you, everybody, for joining. Happy, what are we on, Thursday? I hope everyone's having a great day. My name's Greg Small. I'm the Executive Director of Climate Solutions, and I'm thrilled to have you all join us. This is our 12th edition of Climate Leaders Live. We kicked off, you can do the math, right after COVID started, and we've had a great set of conversations so far, and this is one I've really been looking forward to on something near and dear to my heart, which is transportation electrification. So we're going to go for an hour. If you have any questions, please put those in the Q&A. We will get to those in good time, and appreciate you putting those in there. And we're going to just get right to it. We have an incredible panel, and I'm going to start, instead of introducing our speakers myself, I'm going to hand it off to each of them to just provide some brief background on themselves and their organization, and then we'll get into what I hope is a lively and exciting conversation for all of you. So let me start with you, Leslie. Welcome, really appreciate the time. Tell us a little bit about yourself in Greenlining.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Leslie Aguayo. I'm an Environmental Equity Program Manager with the Greenlining Institute. We are a racial equity organization dedicated to eradicating the barriers of economic mobility that inhibit people of color. And so we do this work through various areas. We do it through health, through energy, through the environment, an economic team, and as well as a tech equity team. And I myself focus on all things transportation decarbonization, so focusing on light duty, medium and heavy duty, and charging infrastructure. Happy to be here, and I will pass it over to V.
Awesome. Thank you, Leslie. Appreciate it.
Good morning, folks. Happy to be here with you all. I'm V. Paykar, and I work with Climate Solutions, and I'm the Oregon Transportation Policy Manager there. And so at Climate Solutions, we work to accelerate clean energy in the Pacific Northwest. And primarily my work focuses around all things transportation electrification, and I approach all my work with a racial justice and social justice lens. So thinking about transportation in all ways that it intersects, so thinking about housing policy as well. Yeah, so in my transportation work, looking at electric vehicles, looking at reducing vehicle miles traveled, equitable transit-oriented development, and all kind of pieces of the transportation world. So with that, I'll pass it off to Fred.
Hey, thanks, V. Good to be here with you and Leslie, and you too, Greg. Greg, thanks for the invitation. This is such an important subject, since transportation now is the biggest source of greenhouse gas pollution in the United States, even bigger than the electric power sector, which for years was the biggest. The Environmental Defense Fund is an organization about 700 or so employees. mostly based in the United States, but also China, Mexico, Europe, and other countries around the world. Climate change is our biggest program, and electrification of transportation has become a real important interest for us because it's so important internationally if we're going to get to zero emissions, which we need to. So with that, Greg, back to you.
Awesome. Thank you. So we're going to bounce around. Transportation electrification is a gigantic issue, and we're going to bounce around to different pieces of it. But Fred, let's stick with you, and I was thinking we could start at sort of national and international level. And I remember, I don't know, it was a month or so ago when I first heard about the General Motors announcement, and my jaw just about dropped. And I know, Fred, you were deeply engaged directly in the conversation with GM. And I wonder if you could just reflect a little bit about, and also right after GM, a bunch of other car companies have made similar types of announcements. And GM in particular, did not have the best track record when it came to electric vehicles and transportation electrification. And I wonder if we could just start with you reflecting on your experience and why you think we've seen such a dramatic shift in the automobile industry and the commitments they're making. And let's just start there. Thank you, Fred.
Well, fundamentally, Greg, it's the competitiveness of GM and indeed every single auto company around the world that depends on this transition. They see, just like we see, the whole world moving to electric vehicles. And the question is for companies like GM and others based in the United States is, will we build the cars here, or will we import them from overseas? So whether it's cars, trucks, or buses, they're either going to be made in places like Michigan and Georgia, or they're going to be shipped here from places like China and the European Union. I think that's why we see all the investments that are being announced. And indeed, time is short because other countries are building out this manufacturing capacity and enabling the market to develop there. And what we found around the world is as sales go up in different continents, that's where the manufacturing tends to be located. So I'm so pleased to see, the president in his plan is planning to invest in manufacturing incentives and consumer incentives to accelerate our race. The last point I'd make here, Greg, is that what's going on with Wall Street is interesting too, and the valuations of these car companies. And I think that's a motivator. There's beginning to be evidence that investors see the capacity of factories to make internal combustion engines as kind of a stranded asset, right, and are devaluing them compared to the capacity to make electric vehicles.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Fred. And I appreciate you bringing up the Biden proposal. We will definitely spend time on that. We will be circling back to that because that's a big part of how we move forward. Leslie, let's turn to you and kind of close to the ground. And, your organization, I know you and many others have been working for many years in California, where you're based on getting electric vehicles and transportation electrification in general dealt with in a much more equitable way. And I wonder if you could just share a little bit about some of the work that you've done, some of the lessons you're seeing, and some of the barriers and the things that we need to continue to do to continue to drive in that direction.
Yeah, this is a big question and one that's super important in order for us to get to our climate goals. I'd start by really wanting to highlight that what we've seen so far in terms of, the way equity is viewed in the transportation decarbonization space is that, we have a long way to go. And oftentimes there isn't even really a clear definition of what equity is. And I think that's step one, right? Making sure that we're all on the same page around what we mean when we say equity. And it's not just, a financial term, right? It's not a return on investment. It's actually making sure that we're investing in people and that everyone has access to the same resources and benefits. So that's one. Additionally, I think it's really important to mention that there is this big gap between deployment and accessibility that we've seen in the field. So oftentimes we will come across, data that shows certain amounts of charging infrastructure, for example, were deployed in census tracts that are identified as disadvantaged communities, or DACs, as they're called in California. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the people that we're trying to target that identify as low income or as, you know, folks that have a harder access to these kinds of investments can actually reach these benefits. And so that's something that I think we really need to focus on, is making sure that it's not just a matter of deploying for deployment's sake, but really getting this benefit into the hands of folks that need it. The third thing I'll mention is we really want to make sure that procedural equity is driven home all the way. Oftentimes we'll see investment plans that have equity as a, you know, just one other component or just one other thing we want to check off the box, but it's not foundational to the actual design of a pilot program or the design of an investment plan. And if equity is not in the design from the get-go, it's not going to have an equitable outcome. And so making sure that we have equity in the mission, in the process, in the implementation, and then also in the evaluation to see if we hit our metrics is really, really important. And procedural equity means that we have to involve the people themselves in that process. So we can't just, you know, tell folks what they need and how they should be able to use this technology, but hearing from them is really important, not only because we'll see success in terms of buy-in, but because that's really ultimately who the benefits are for, right? They're for people, and transportation is to move people from point A to point B. It's not just about cars themselves. And the last thing I'll mention is an importance in operationalizing this equity, right? I think right now, again, to my earlier point about defining equity, it can be really ambiguous and nebulous and daunting and intimidating for folks to understand what equity is, but even more so, how do you operationalize it? How do you codify it, right? Like, how do you measure equity? And so figuring out within conversations how to establish equity metrics and equity data is super important, so that we can actually say, okay, from point A to point B, we were able to accomplish X in terms of equity. And so for also establishing really clear metrics to get to zero emission by 2035 or 2045, we also need to be just as strict with our equity metrics and goals to reach that same future.
Great. Thank you, Leslie. V, I'm going to turn to you in a sec, but I just want to flag, I was reading one of your blog posts earlier today, Leslie, particularly about the California Public Utility Commission, and they made a massive investment in utility. We were talking about some of the equity provisions. So I want to hear a little bit more about that in a second, and also want to turn to all of you at some point to talk a little bit about the role of utilities, who are so important in this. And so just want to put that on the radar screen as something we'll get to. But V, what are you seeing in Oregon and in the Northwest around electrification, and particularly around equity, and how we can make sure we get that right from the get-go, including some of the issues around procedural equity that that Leslie talked about?
Yeah, definitely. So I think with transportation electrification, you know, a lot of folks immediately do think of like electric vehicles, and yeah, that's part of it. So I definitely want to like highlight that in Oregon, for example, the rebate program that exists here in Oregon for electric vehicles, there's a component that has there's a charge ahead rebate, and which is specifically geared towards income eligible applicants. So to giving, making sure that they have the opportunity to receive rebates for new and used electric vehicles. And that's something actually right now that's going in the Oregon legislature with House Bill 2165 to extend that program and to increase the rebate amount so that it can make a bigger dent on the purchase of new and used electric vehicles. And so while that is important, I think, you know, these different pieces that Leslie outlined, all those pieces of equity are so important. And I think one thing that Leslie said, and I just want to like hone in on, it's like ultimately, we're like, oh, okay, this is what we need to be doing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We need to electrify, and we need to reduce vehicle miles traveled. But at the end of the day, we're not looking at what the community needs are, because ultimately, for example, if we're expanding electric vehicle options in communities and in a community that predominantly doesn't drive or doesn't have, access to get a driver's license, then, what are we doing? So at the end of the day, that's when it's so important to make sure that we're involving those community needs in the processes so we can see transportation electrification as a whole. And I think still we're still stuck in that, like, checking the box off of equity. And I feel like it's been talked about for the last couple of decades, like, oh yeah, we're moving to actually integrating this into the processes. But ultimately, it's like we're starting with this outcome that we want, which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, without really saying how can we make sure that people can have all these options to ultimately reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I think it's that kind of chicken or the egg scenario. Ultimately, if we want to make sure that everyone can participate in this transition to transportation electrification, it's going to have to start at community needs and kind of communities leading the way of what they want to see in their community and expanding all the transportation options. I mean, if we're asking people to reduce the amount that they drive, but not providing appropriate transportation options, I mean, how are people supposed to do that? So I am just honing in on that point, and because I think it's still something that we're missing. And then also, if we're going to be doing community, understanding what community needs are, we have to pay people to be present and to provide their skills and expertise and knowledge about their community to agencies, to municipalities, to really get to the crux of what is needed in a community and how we can push for that acceleration of transportation electrification.
Thanks, V. Well, let me put more on this issue of community, and particularly community impacts. I mean, I think a lot of times when the media and others cover transportation electrification, they focus on electric vehicles. Super important. We all understand how important that is. But in terms of community impacts, a lot of times it's not the cars, it's the buses and it's the delivery vans, and it's the people who are living right next to highways that are taking the brunt of it. So it's a lot of the impacts, and a lot of places we need to see change is around those medium and heavy duties vehicles. And so, we've seen some commitments. Amazon made a commitment to doing 100,000 delivery vans, and California, and another thing that just made my jaw drop, made a commitment around medium and heavy duty trucks. So I wonder if folks can just talk about what trends people are seeing there, because those do have such massive air pollution impacts on everybody, but particularly people of color. So anyone who wants to start with that question on what you're seeing and what more needs to be done in the medium and heavy duty space would be appreciated.
Well, Greg, first of all, I agree completely with what Leslie and V have said, and congratulations to the Greenlining for your great work on that, and Climate Solutions, same. We've got to listen to the people in the neighborhoods, and they've got to be at the table when decisions are being made. We have to understand what the neighborhoods need. One of the things we've heard as we've been listening more is air pollution in these neighborhoods, as you just said, Greg, is high. We've done some studies in California under, if you're playing California Bill Bingo, AB 617. We've been part of studies that have showed that, if you live near certain roads, the particulates that you're breathing in can be 80% higher than if you're living near a very similar highway that you would think would have the same impact. But because of different amounts of diesel truck traffic on the different roads, the impacts are completely different. And this results in thousands of excess deaths a year and much higher rates of asthma among people and kids that are living near these roads. In terms of trends, Greg, we're seeing, both Ford and GM actually have announced they're going to be producing electric vehicle delivery vans. And, we are urging the Biden administration to require these by 2030. There's no reason that if you live near a port or in an urban area where it's easy to electrify these functions, there's no reason that that can't be done and fast, because these vehicles just make a lot of economic sense and are much better for the neighborhood.
Awesome. Yeah, Leslie V, anything you want to add to this topic?
A lot, but I'll keep it short. I think that medium and heavy duty investment and prioritization, as you mentioned, is super important, right? A lot of this, the pollution and GHGs that we're referring to do come from medium and heavy duty vehicles. And right, because of a history of racist policies, because of redlining, a lot of communities that are communities of color that are lower income bear the brunt of this pollution. And as Fred was mentioning, often also bear the brunt of health conditions and illnesses. And now because of COVID, we're seeing that correlation skyrocket even more, particularly because COVID is also exacerbates pulmonary issues. And so to that, I think it's super important to not only look at the impact that medium and heavy duty vehicles can make in terms of air pollution, but really focus on it as a tool for equity. And that can include, workforce development and labor standards. It can mean community benefits agreements. It can mean replacing polluting school buses as well and public transit. It's not just delivery, which is a big issue, but we can electrify and make the entire system clean. One of my favorite programs that I like to highlight that in California, out of the California Energy Commission, is the school bus replacement program. It's pretty innovative, and they select lower income school districts to subsidize their polluting vehicles or subsidize the transition of their polluting vehicles to clean vehicles and clean school buses. But what we heard actually during an interview for one of our reports that recently came out, the Greenlining Playbook on clean mobility options, was that when COVID hit, school districts were able to use these electric buses to deliver free and reduced price lunches and meals for students that were on these programs. They were also able to use the buses to deliver materials for homework or supplies that they might need for school. And in some cases, because of the battery storage, they were able to use the buses for Wi-Fi hotspots, which is super innovative. And so thinking about how to use the batteries also as emergency backups is really important to think about, right? So there's so many benefits to electrifying medium and heavy duty vehicles that isn't just Amazon delivery, even though they should also comply. It's being creative and making sure that we cater to the needs of the community. And again, as Dee was mentioning, if it isn't a light duty vehicle or folks that need to drive, maybe it is a school bus, maybe it is car share, maybe it's active transportation, maybe it's public transit. And two more things that I quickly want to highlight in California are the Advanced Clean Fleets Rule and the Advanced Clean Truck Rule. And I believe that might be what you were referring to earlier. So the Advanced Clean Truck Rule passed in June of 2020, and it was a first of its kind regulation that really aimed at reaching 100% zero emission vehicle sales of medium and heavy duty vehicles by 2045. And now we're working on the Advanced Clean Fleets Rule, which is the accompaniment of that first ACT rule, to really get fleets to meet the manufacturing standards that we set by the ACT rule. Through the conversations, though, that I think were really impressive and something that I learned through this process was focusing on lower income and smaller owner operated fleets, right? So often we'll think about, again, these larger Amazons and the UPSs and FedExes who definitely do need to comply, but they're also better resourced to comply with these standards. So if we really think about, the small folks that have one truck or two trucks that they operate themselves. How do we support them, right? How do we support them so that they aren't burdened by these regulations, but so that they can be either subsidized or assisted through a program that can really benefit the transition of their own fleets? And that also includes, making sure that contractors have benefits, right? Oftentimes we'll see, at least in California, I believe it was Prop 22, if I'm not mistaken, was the Uber and Lyft ruling that made it so that gig workers were not official, full-time employees with benefits. And this actually does affect contract workers who own their own trucks, which means that they do not have the same resources to make this transition. And so, who are we leaving behind, I guess, is the question that I'm asking when we try to make this transition to clean vehicles.
Yeah, thank you. That's going to be a good segue to the next question. But V, anything else to add on the medium heavy duty for now?
Yeah, no, definitely agree with those points. I would say, like, on the Oregon side as well, that's something that, we're looking here in the state to see if we can adopt California's advanced clean truck rule as well, and the low NOx rule, thinking about, the diesel engines that are still, in the state, and thinking about regulating emissions there is going to be super important. And I think too, like, I could probably touch upon this later when we talk about Biden's infrastructure plan, but thinking about, like, the money that's going for EV rebates, like, are there rebates going towards, like, medium heavy duty and, like, supporting these smaller businesses or contractors who own their vehicles and want to make the switch? Because ultimately them, the people who do work in these trucks are ultimately the people who are, polluted the most as far as, like, the diesel emissions that they breathe in sitting in these trucks for days and days at a time. So yeah, this is the last piece that I'll add.
V, that's such an important point. The incentives need to work for medium and heavy duty, not just for the passenger stuff, because it's the medium and heavy duty that are producing the pollutants that kill us. Passenger cars do produce greenhouse gases, but in terms of an environmental justice, of a community focus, the medium and heavy duty, you would think they would be, and I'm hopeful they will be, a major priority to the Biden administration. And Leslie, I'm so glad that you added school buses and other sorts of buses to the conversation, because there are now studies that are good studies that show if your kid rides on a yellow school bus that's got a diesel engine, they're going to perform worse in school than if they ride on an electric bus. And we've got to urgently convert the nation's bus fleet to clean vehicles, zero emitting vehicles. And, in terms of other states adopting that advanced truck rule that California has been in the lead on, and thanks again to Greenlining and Earth Justice that champion that. Massachusetts and New Jersey have, already moved forward. So it's great to hear, V, that that's going to be part of the climate solutions work to get Oregon and Washington to follow suit.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, go ahead, V, please.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, for the school buses piece, I think it was like about more than 50% of US children use a school bus to get to school. So it is a huge impact for the kids of this country to make that shift and have these electric school buses.
Yeah, thank you. And this medium and heavy duty issue, for all the reasons we've talked about, it's definitely why this is a top tier priority for climate solutions moving forward. And we're excited to join with California. So often the case, California sets the pace, but the impact is really felt when a lot of other states make it happen. And, a big part of the fear of change that we subscribe to at Climate Solutions is really about, sort of where you sit is where you stand. And we sit in the states, and we believe that when you get a high accumulation of states to make change, yes, it would be great for federal bills to pass. Change the market already, and you've done a lot of the work. So even though some states might not pass the exact same bill, the market will have changed because so much critical mass will have already hit. So that's why more and more states adopting things that often happen first in California makes such a big impact. All right, I'm dying to get into the Biden plan, but I'm going to take one question from the Q&A because I think it's incredibly important, and then we'll dive into that. It's from Howard, and this is such an important question, not just around transportation electrification, but frankly for all of the transitions underway. But the question is, can you discuss groups that would be displaced by vehicle electrification? Auto workers, gas station owners, to car mechanics, and how to ease the transition for them. This is a huge issue. You hear conversations from labor unions, it takes less employees to produce electric vehicles than it does internal combustion engine. They need less maintenance, which of course for a car owner is fantastic, but for people who are in that business is not as good. So for anyone, how do we think about, first of all, who do we think are some of the people who may get left behind in this transition? And how do we make sure that we get that right from the get-go? Again, open up to anyone who wants to go on this one.
Well, I would say this is a really important issue, and we've got to make all the just transitions for all the workers that are going to be impacted by change, and that includes coal workers and oil and gas workers, as well as auto workers. We are, and others in the environmental community have been deeply in dialogue with the United Auto Workers, talking to them about this, because there are jobs to be had in the United States if we get on with the transition. If, on the other hand, we stall and allow the European Union to incentivize their market and their manufacturers, and Asia to do the same, because consumers want these vehicles, they are superior products. They cost less to fuel, less for maintenance, and within a few short years, they're going to cost less to buy as the price of batteries goes down. So the question really is, are we going to keep the jobs in the auto industry in the United States or not? Are we going to make sure batteries are being made here in the United States, or are we going to be shipping them in from Europe and Asia? So this is a really important issue. I'm glad you raised it, Greg, and our approach to figuring out the best solution is by talking to the United Auto Workers and the workers in the supply chain and figuring out what it will take for them to transition to those new jobs, and do what we can to make sure those new jobs are good jobs.
How do you think those conversations are going so far? Where do you see progress? Where do you see sort of some tough spots that are going to be hard to iron out?
I'm hopeful. I'm very hopeful. I'm not able to say more than that, but I think the fact that we are in a good conversation and people understand that there is change coming, and let's shape that change. Let's get in front of it to make sure it's good for workers, good for communities, good for community air pollution, and good for the climate.
Yeah. V and Leslie, how do you think about just transition and all these issues here? And it is so important that we get this right. And I would just say editorially, I think that the climate and environmental movement, broadly speaking, has done historically too much hand waving around job transition. And I think that's changing. I think that the conversations are way more serious. Fred, you referenced, and it's not like we've done nothing on here, but I think we've learned some lessons in the past about how important it is that we are deeply serious about this, not just in our rhetoric, which I think we've generally been fine on our rhetoric, but we are deeply focused on this from the get-go in honest, collaborative conversations, the policies. And again, I want to get to Biden. I think he's done an amazing job at putting some of these provisions in there. So I just think we're doing a much better job as a community. And, we've learned lessons from the past. But V and Leslie, what would you add to this important just transition conversation?
Yeah, I was going to say, again, like just pointing to the Biden infrastructure plan, also there are like billions of dollars set aside for kind of this workforce development and retraining. So thinking a lot about this just transition. The other piece that I would add too is just like thinking about how we're training people who are in school now. And so thinking about these like vocational programs and saying like, okay, if this is where like the market is going, how are we making sure that our schools are equipped to like be teaching these kinds of things, right? So even just looking at like community colleges around the United States, like not a lot of them have kind of these training programs to work on like electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles, right? Which are great mechanic jobs. And so in that sense, it's just like, we're missing out there. So I think that that's also a conversation to be had and like investments to be done. And then on the vocational training side of things and making sure that future generations are able to come into these newer types of jobs that our economy is shifting to.
Leslie, anything on this?
Yeah, Dee beat me to it, but I similarly think that there is a lot of hope for this just transition conversation, in particular, you know, how we want to see the future of the green economy go, and really investing in folks that are going to be impacted the most by this transition is super important, right? Mechanics, manufacturers, et cetera. And there's ways that we currently have through policy to do that, right? Community benefits agreement is one way, local hires, training, workforce development standards, in addition to community college partnerships, which we've already seen some pilots through also the California Energy Commission here in California. You know, thinking about how we can get folks that are previously incarcerated folks to coming out of jails and prisons in investing in their education in this new green economy, I think is also a really big opportunity that we can also invest in as well.
Great, thank you. All right, let's get into it. Biden's American Jobs Act was announced, what, a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago. I just have to say, I don't think I've ever been as excited about a piece of federal legislation on climate in my entire life. I feel like if anything even close to what is proposed gets across the finish line, it will be by orders of magnitude the most important climate bill ever passed in this country. It is just a monster opportunity. There are a million components to it, but let's, for the sake of this conversation, if folks could reflect on what are the pieces of the American Jobs Act that are most important for this transportation electrification piece. Yeah, so let's just start there. And I wonder if others share my enthusiasm overall for this bill and its opportunity to be transformative. You know, maybe let's start with either V or Leslie on this one. Any reflections on that?
I can go ahead and start. I think, you know, definitely on like the transportation electrification side, we saw, you know, the proposal is a lot of money for electric vehicles, thinking about that like electric vehicle charging infrastructure that's going to be kind of expanded nationwide. So talking about like about 500,000 charging infrastructure or charging stations being deployed nationwide. I mean, that's huge, just like in the electric vehicle sense. There's also a lot of money that's coming in, as we saw, for like rail, so Amtrak, and then also for public transit. So both of those, I mean, it's just like orders of magnitude bigger than what we currently have. And thinking about like public transit operations now, just with COVID and a lot of transit agencies are suffering, this could be a really huge deal for a lot of transit agencies across the country. I think that you know, ultimately the devil's in the details as well, because it's like, okay, it's important that these proposals with this amount of money is being offered. Also, I think like the main thing, for example, for public transit is like how much is going to be invested into operations versus capital costs. And so that's a big problem that we have, like not enough money is being pushed towards operations. So yeah, seeing more money going towards there. And then another piece is, you know, there's like 20 billion being proposed for neighborhoods that have been like cut off due to kind of this inner city highway construction that we saw in the 50s, and ultimately have exacerbated these issues of air pollution, disproportionately low income and Black, Indigenous people of color communities. And so I'm glad to see all those proposals. And at the same time, it's like we're still seeing money for kind of this like fix it, which is important for our infrastructure, infrastructure like for the roads pieces. I think the infrastructure for, replacing all the lead pipes and all these other things are super important and way overdue. But also I think like there is, I am cautious about that kind of that infrastructure spending on like roads and what it means, because ultimately if we're still like expanding highways, we're never going to like solve our problems in terms of reducing the amount of vehicles on the road. And so I think that there needs to be, it's kind of hard to, I think right now it's just like thinking about like, yeah, those devils in the details of just like, how is this money going to be spent? What's prioritized? And ultimately, how are we transitioning into this new age of transportation, what transportation can look like for the country, instead of just like putting bandages on things that we know don't work. And so I'm curious to see how that will play out, but it is very exciting and definitely I think it could be even bigger, but this is very exciting.
Yeah. Leslie, anything from you on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we hit it out of the park there with all of her comments, but I do want to also highlight one specific area, which is, again, this is a lot of money. It's a lot of investment. It's a big opportunity. And in order to do this equitably, we have to also consider, again, all of these components of what do folks really need. It's not a one size fits all. It's investing in public transit. It's investing in active transportation, in rail, right? It can't be just, a one-to-one replacement of combustion vehicles to electric vehicles. It has to really work. And if we're doing it nationally, right, like just even the diversity within one state, in the state of California, is already so nuanced that implementing this on a national scale is super important to make sure that there are enough guidelines to make sure that there's direction in how to do this equitably, but also enough flexibility so that we have the input of folks themselves to tell us, right, where these investments are going to make the most impact for them. To that, I think that investing in charging infrastructure is super, super important. That's a really big area, right? It's a chicken and egg conversation. You can invest in these medium and heavy duty vehicles and subsidies for light duty vehicles, but if the charging infrastructure isn't there, it's not going to work for people. And so how do you create or how do you gather enough data from folks to be able to know where investments make the most sense? And how to do that equitably. And so I think that there's a lot to learn from California and from other states that are leading the way. And it's really great to see a national conversation, because now it seems like the DC is leading the way and it's not California. So we really need to pick up the pace. Yeah, and I would like to just plug in really quickly. Greenlining actually developed a playbook for clean mobility pilots that we recently published. And we did a landscape analysis of different clean mobility equity pilots across the state of California, and did, an assessment of lessons learned and things to do and what not to do when investing in clean transportation. So I think that could be a really helpful tool as well.
Awesome. Fred, I have little doubt that EDF is knee deep in all of these issues. So what's your perspective, and what role is EDF playing in helping to shape and get this across the finish line?
Well, thanks, Greg. We are talking to people in the White House and people in Congress several times a day. And I think what's in the bill now is a starting point. I actually agree with V. The amount for electrification should be higher and may end up being higher. I think in terms of how the money is spent, how much is spent on consumer electrics, consumer incentives, versus, diesel bus moving to replace diesel buses with electric vehicles. There is a program, an expanded program happily in the proposal, but how the ratios work, how much goes for manufacturing incentives, this is where I think Congress will play a big role, and I hope with a big eye toward the just transition that we were talking about earlier. So I think the devil is in the details, and I don't think the details put out in the Biden proposal are yet, hard and fast. And I think there's an opportunity for all of us who care to be in touch with our congressmen and senators who are critical to this. And of course, in the Pacific Northwest, there's a couple of folks who are right at the heart of this debate.
For sure. No doubt. Absolutely. There's so much more I want to talk about on there, but I want to make sure that we hit on one other topic, and then I want to get to some other questions. And that is, the frame of this conversation really is about transportation and transportation electrification. And as we talked about at the beginning, the biggest source of emissions in the United States is in the transportation space. Transportation electrification is only one of the major components to actually reducing our transportation emissions. It's an important one, it's valuable, but it's not the only one. And I wonder if folks could just reflect on how to think about reducing transportation emissions at a more comprehensive way, and how transportation electrification is just a piece of it, and what other components are critical to making sure that we get all the way we need to go. Again, turn this to whoever wants to go first.
I can, something that I've been thinking a lot about, and I'm not an expert in urban planning. And so I know, like my other colleagues, Leslie, you're more trained in this, so definitely please fill in anything that I get wrong. But I think there's a lot of like transportation and housing, how I mentioned earlier, are really interlinked. And I would think that what I would like to see is in the US, like all these major cities moving into planning that is focused around like this 15-minute city. So thinking about like how you can bike or walk to all the necessities that you need to get to. So thinking in that framework that transportation isn't about getting from point A to point B, but it's about access. So in that regards, it's like, does everyone have access and opportunity to get to the grocery store, to get to their doctor's appointments, to get to school, to get to jobs? So like that's what I'm thinking about, like what I'd like to see transportation evolve to. And so when I mentioned earlier, it's like we're constantly like putting band-aids on things that don't work. It's like we have this transportation system, it doesn't work for everybody. And what we need to be thinking of is just like completely different things. And so in that sense, I think like there's also that zoning piece, and that's also going to be a very important conversation of how do we allow for more dense cities to exist? How do we allow for more affordable housing options to exist near job centers, near schools, near all these other needs that we need to have a thriving kind of city and livable city? So that's just one thing that I have in my mind. It's just like that's where I see transportation evolving to.
Thank you. Leslie, Fred?
Yeah, I'm really glad that Vee mentioned the intersectionality of transportation, right? Our transportation does not exist in a vacuum or in a silo. It is really to move people. That's its only purpose. If there were no people, there would be no transportation. And so, yeah, I think this conversation around holistically understanding how transportation works with housing, with jobs, with just a higher quality of life is super important. And so what does that look like? What kinds of policies and tools do we currently have in our toolbox, or can we further develop to get to that ideal city? Is that transit-oriented development, right? Is it more active transportation? Is it making sure that there aren't any food deserts around, so that a lot of folks don't have to travel super far, or that we're investing in public education so that folks don't have to, commute to long distances to go to work or to go to school. And so I think that that's super important. I also noticed that in the chat, some folks mentioned, transportation, including ports and air travel.
Yeah.
And I'm less well versed in air travel, but I have done a little bit of digging on port electrification. I think that that's super important as well, right? These are major freight hubs. The Port of Oakland, the Port of Long Beach are some of the highest polluted ports in California. A lot of our, what's the term I'm looking for? Packages are coming into those ports. And so when you really look at maps of GHGs, it's heavily concentrated near airports, near ports, and then these ports also go to distribution centers, which are also located in communities of color. And then these distribution centers expand and disperse themselves in freeway corridors that are also going through communities of color. And so if you can really kind of reverse engineer where all this pollution is going and look at the sources, which are these ports, which are these freight hubs, and electrify those first, it would actually, I think, have a greater transition into how we can clean up the air a little bit quicker. But I think, again, it's all about looking at the connections of everything.
Yeah.
Boy, I so agree with that. Electrifying the ports is just so important, and the communities. It's not just the greenhouse gases, it's the conventional pollutants that are hurting people near the transportation hubs and the ports. And I did see the question also in the chat about shipping and air. So I might say shipping, if it were a nation, would be the 6th largest polluter. And emissions from shipping are expected to double between now and 2050. Thankfully, the International Maritime Organization, going by the acronym IMO, did agree in 2018 to adopt a goal of reducing from current levels, but it's not enough. Reducing by 50% by 2050 doesn't get us to net zero or zero of any sort. Right. So, and even when they did that, they came up with no mechanisms for how they would enforce a reduction. So not as much progress with shipping as we'd like to see. And on aviation, though, there's more progress. Yeah. There, the International Civil Aviation Organization, the acronym there is ICAO, has adopted something called Corsia, which caps emissions from airlines between now and 2035. We'd like to see a reduction, even though air traffic is expected to double or triple. And but aviation's a little bit ahead because the airlines have agreed to begin to limit their emissions.
Yeah. Thank you. All right, we're starting to run against the clock, so let me pull some of these questions. This is from Bert. I want to pull a particular piece of this. Along with public transit, electrification of transportation will only work with aggressive expansion of vehicle charging stations, including public charging in rural areas in small towns and communities of color and within multifamily buildings. What's next for Washington and Oregon to fix that? I mean, we've talked about some of these issues already. I want to specifically pull out, and I don't know if anyone has expertise in this, but the issue of electrifying in rural communities and towns. I mean, we certainly talked a lot about electrifying in urban communities, and it makes a lot of sense. There's density, et cetera. But I think it's incredibly important that we also think about how can we electrify and get infrastructure built in small towns and rural communities for all sorts of reasons across the country. And I just wonder if anyone has done work. And, you know, Leslie, I know you've looked at electrification across California. I don't know if you've looked in rural, Fred, others, but how do we think about rural and small town electrification?
Yeah, rural and unincorporated areas, I think, are super important to consider, oftentimes because they get the short end of the stick when it comes to investment and public funding. You know, they're not, they're not the shiny, like sexy city that you want to invest in. But they are super critical and important because especially as we're seeing the suburbanization of poverty increase, people that cannot afford to live in urban centers anymore are moving further and further away and having less and less resources. And so to invest in these areas is super important because these are the folks that are making the largest commutes, that are like moving away to afford housing, but are still commuting into the city and are still sitting in traffic, exposing themselves to pollution and also polluting the air, oftentimes because these folks are also lower income, or are unable to afford more expensive housing in the urban centers, do tend to have older cars and older polluting vehicles. And have less access to public transit, right? So these are the folks that we should also really be looking at. I believe Fred mentioned earlier, AB 617 communities, right? These are the areas in California that are frontline communities, which means that they are first and worst exposed to both poverty and pollution. They're the top 25% quartile of the California Enviro screen of these folks. And so if you look, there is a large percentage of folks that live in AB 617 communities that are in the Central Valley, which is where in California we have large agricultural areas. And it's really important to invest in these folks so that not only do they have access to clean transportation, but quality of life again increases. And if this looks like public transit, if this looks like, you know, greater subsidies to electric vehicles or car sharing, whatever that might look like, depending on that need, we really need to incorporate folks from those areas.
Great. Thanks. Fred, any thoughts on this?
Nothing to add. Great answer.
Awesome. Well, we're about at the clock, so I want to be really respectful of people's time, and I want to provide an opportunity for each of you to have any closing thoughts, and you can really close on anything you want, but to the degree that you can speak a little bit to, you know, what more can we be doing as a climate justice movement? What more can people who are joining this call do to make sure that we can get some of these things we've been talking about from, you know, across the finish line and implemented? So maybe I'll start with you, Fred, and then go to you, Leslie, and then be with the final word with some closing thoughts.
Well, thanks, Greg. Great conversation. I think, you know, speaking for the Environmental Defense Fund, what we can do, and responsibility starts, you know, with us, is our organization needs to recognize that communities, local cities, local frontline groups need to and are already leading the charge to clean up their neighborhoods. We need to make our expertise and resources available to support their leadership in this fight. And I think that's critical. Beyond that, you know, everyone listening in can, you know, be in touch with Climate Solutions, with Greenlining, you know, with EDF. And, you know, when the moment is there that there's a critical vote in the California legislature or Congress, you know, our organizations all have mechanisms to let you know, so you can speak up, you know, and we can all rise to the moment.
Awesome. Thanks, Fred. Leslie?
Yeah, I think similarly, we know we really need a swell and a momentum going from a large, diverse coalition of folks that are on the same page. And I think that that is super important, especially in a time where, you know, democracy is something that's a really powerful tool. Additionally, I think it's always important to remember that, well, I'll speak again also for Greenlining, you know, equity is foundational. It's not ornamental. It's not supplemental. If something is really going to be successful and work for everyone, it has to have equity in mind from the get-go. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And so if we have an equity lens at anything really, but if we're looking at transportation, really looking at it through an equity lens is super important. And, you know, to the extent that, you know, whatever power and voice that any individual might have to make sure that people that are in most need are prioritized, I think that that's super important. And again, I'm just going to go back to defining equity, having procedural equity, including community voices, and not, you know, assuming that we know what's best for folks, but really letting them decide and be advocates for themselves.
Great. And V, you get the final, well, I'll get the final word as the moderator, but final word from you.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely echo what Leslie and Fred shared about like democratizing our work, and so it's not just like when the votes are happening, but making sure that community power is built in and that the community is the one, leading and designing what works for the community in terms of if we're talking about transportation or whatever it is. The other piece I'll just add is just like I think it's important for like the environmental movement to continue making our work so like very intersectional, because we don't exist in a silo. As we talked about so many different issues on transportation, it touches all different facets of our lives. So I think that like intersectional piece is going to be super important. It is super important. And I think just like leaving that question of just like, if, we solve climate change, tomorrow, would our world be okay, or would it be saved, and ultimately like these problems still exist. So I think that that's why it's like we have to be intersectional and holistic on how we're solving these problems to make sure that we're creating a world where it's people-centered, where people can thrive. And this is all people and not just those in power and those select few. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, V, Leslie, Fred. Incredibly grateful for all the work that you and your organizations do, and for your time today, and for all of you that joined. Really grateful for your time. Our next Climate Leaders Live will be sometime in May. We'll announce that soon, and we're going to have a recording of this, and it'll be up on our website sometime in the next few days or early next week. And feel free to share this with others. And thank you. Have a great day, everyone. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Thank you.